All right, so today's economics lesson is going to be on labor issues. All right, so talking about the workers and the owners and things of that nature. Um, and so we're going to deal with that today, and then the role build into the role of government from now. We'll hold a target time if you've got questions on grades and what you need to do to get to where you need to be towards the last couple of weeks of this class. Um, Tuesday, Thursday. Please look and see, what your feedback on, especially the essay parts of quizzes, or if you've not done an entire amount of a adminum tutorial or something of that nature. And then obviously be checking your Canvas inbox and email daily. I've sent most of the grade updates for this week already last night and this morning. Got a few more of those to do. Um, but just remember that we have only a couple of weeks left in this class in terms of grading. And so the last day for grades is going to be the 17th. So we got 2 full weeks of stuff to do. Okay. This is going to be a regular looking week this week with 2 live lessons, 2 adminum tutorials, and then a quiz. Okay. And then again, there will be a multiple choice part and an essay part. And as I've done the last couple of weeks, I decided I liked it with the multiple choice on progress learning and the essay on Canvas. Okay. So that's how I'm going to do it again this week. Next week, because of the possibility of some people having EOCs, not many of y'all will, but it's possible for maybe a different class, whatever. Um, that we're on next week. Okay, so from the 11th to the 15th, those will all be asynchronous, meaning no live lessons. That there will be, because I wanted to deal with the personal finance part of this class, I picked out an adminum tutorial for every day that I want you to do there. Remember that the assigned amount of time that your parent is filling out that you've spent per week on your education. They're filling out a form, which is the one that our school uses to report what you've done. Says that you're spending 30 to 35 minutes or 30 to 35 hours a week on your school. So, given that you have 4 classes and 2 to 3 of them are more academic and 1 to 2 that are related arts, that means you should be spending 8 to 10 hours a week on this course. Okay, and frankly, not that many people are. So I'm not going to, take any complaint on the fact that I'm giving you 4 adminum tutorials for grade on the last graded week. You can get those done in less than 10 hours for sure. Okay. Although, what hopefully you're finding is that you're not making A's on those things if you're not putting in like 45 minutes or to an hour on each one, just because you can't do all the work and do it properly in less than that amount of time. All right, so this week we're going to work on this particular standard, and we've actually managed not necessarily in quite the depth that I would like, but in a solid 8 weeks, we're going to get through the vast majority of the econ standards. Okay, so um, this one is research and evaluate geopolitical influences. So that means geography, politics, right? Influences on employment trends and issues at the state and national level, analyzing how international trade, geography, government policies, collective bargaining, labor market conditions, and the prices of goods and services affect employment trends. Okay, so some of these right here, like the collective bargaining, we're going to get into that today. Some of these things right here, and then next time into that one. So you can kind of see what I'm thinking there. All right, so I'm gonna I'm a history guy really, and so the thing with social studies is that they all kind of weave together, and so because I'm a history guy, you get a little more bit more history with your when I'm teaching the econ classes. All right, so the story is going to begin with the Industrial Revolution. All right, and that's when the what we would call the modern owner and worker relationship really becomes what we think of. Before that, you had more of like the feudal lord, right, and the peasants working for them, who the lord owned all the land, kind of thing. So, and you've had different systems throughout history, but that's the one coming out of Europe that then from that one, it breaks down and we end up into the modern capitalist system, the one that we're thinking about when we think about the owner and worker relationship. Okay. Um, so the Industrial Revolution starts in England in the late 1700s. Due to the factors that lead to, economic growth were all there. Then the United States, then Western Europe, then it moved east and south across the globe, right? And that's even to the present. Again, we're talking driven by profit, business owners who, weren't looking out for their workers' best interests, right? Their safety, their health, their well-being, and prosperity. So the business owners, it benefited them to get people to work for as little money as possible for as long as possible, right? And so if there's nothing restraining them, unless they're just good people, then they're going to take advantage of that for their own benefit. Okay. And I think you would see, a lot of that. And I think that if you think, oh yeah, I wouldn't be that way, I don't know. Maybe you would, but I think a lot of people, when they, it's kind of like Scrooge McDuck, and when he's playing Ebenezer Scrooge on the Christmas Carol, where he just becomes so in love with his money that he loses track of everybody else, right? I think that's kind of the classic picture of the Industrial Revolution to me. So eventually the workers, feeling this oppression and mistreatment, are going to start working together, forming what we call unions. Okay, so the idea of a union is working together to argue for better working conditions, pay, etc. So the union organization, if things are not right, might call for a strike, which of course is refusing to work until conditions improve or until their demands are met. All right, and so then, in the 1800s and early to mid 1900s, there's a lot of strikes with a lot of violence that occurs over the arguments between the labor unions and then the owners and management of the industry. Okay, so I'm going to just give you one example of this. It's a kind of a prime example in U.S. history. Kind of see what happens with sometimes the unions and the management and their violence. Okay, so this one's called the Homestead Strike. It deals with Carnegie Steel in Pittsburgh. So if you know the Pittsburgh Steelers, right, that's where the steel industry was based. Hold on, I need to share my sound.
The Homestead Strike. The waning decades of the 19th century saw a rise in the influence and power of organized labor unions. They were responsible for major changes in the lives of the workers who toiled to produce the materials that were transforming America into an industrial powerhouse. This put them at odds with the owners and operators of the factories and mills in which they worked, specifically Andrew Carnegie. The Carnegie Steel Company owned the Homestead Steel Works, among others, located in Homestead, Pennsylvania. In the summer of 1892, this would be the location of a defining moment in the struggle of organized labor in United States history. In 1889, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the union that represented some of the workers at the Homestead Steelworks, won a difficult victory in a strike over wages and working conditions. This agreement was set to expire 3 years later, in July of 1892. When the time came to renew the agreement, Carnegie had instructed his manager, Henry Clay Frick, to break the union and to reorganize the whole affair. Although he was ostensibly in favor of workers' rights to organize, Carnegie thought the terms of the prior agreement were too restrictive and a hindrance to the operation of his business. The price of finished steel was down, so he needed to reduce wages, reduce the number of workers, or both. At Carnegie's direction, Frick negotiated with the union through late spring and early summer, offering terms that the union would certainly reject. On June 28, 1892, Frick began closing down parts of the mill and locking the workers out of their jobs. When this failed to force the union's hand, Frick closed the remaining parts of the Homestead Works. With the beginning of the lockout, the union voted to strike. Dubbed Fort Frick, barbed wire, sniper towers, and powerful water cannons were added to a wall along the mill. These measures were to keep out the workers. The strikers laid siege to the mill. Boats, trains, and even law enforcement deputies were turned away in an effort to prevent strikebreakers from getting into the mill. Frick wanted to regain access to the besieged mill in order to restart production with non-union workers on July 6th. On the night of the 5th, 300 men from the Pinkerton Detective Agency boarded barges downriver. The plan was to secretly tow them up to Homestead, where they would surprise the striking workers and take control of the mill. Alerted of the plan, the workers and many residents went to the mill to repel the Pinkertons. A firefight erupted, lasting over 14 hours. By the time they surrendered, 3 Pinkerton men were dead. 9 strikers had also lost their lives. Almost a week later, 6,000 Pennsylvania state militia were brought in on the orders of Governor Pattison to take back the Homestead Steelworks. The company hastily built bunkhouses and kitchens, then brought in non-union strikebreakers to live at the plant while the state militia guarded the exterior. The furnaces were relit on July 15th. Striking workers attempted to enter the plant to stop relighting, but were met with the bayonets of the militiamen, wounding 6 workers. Many of the steelworkers.
So what you should notice there is one of the things that was making it hard for the strikers to win is the fact that there was other labor available to do their jobs. Okay, and I think that's a big key issue in understanding when labor can be successful and their demands are not.
Were arrested and charged with crimes for the shootout with the Pinkertons. None of the Pinkertons were charged due to brutality they faced upon surrendering. With the plant running at full production, the union was broken, but some tried to hold on. Finally, on July 23rd, Alexander Berkman, a known anarchist, came to town and made an assassination attempt on Henry Clay Frick. Frick was both shot and stabbed, but survived the attack. Public support eroded after the attempt on Frick, and the strike finally ended with the union workers going back to work on Carnegie's terms. The handling of the strike was a serious blow to Andrew Carnegie's reputation, but worse damage was done to the labor movement. The once powerful Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was a shadow of its former self. Its membership depleted, efforts to de-unionize other mills in the Midwest were successful. Organized labor in the region would take decades to recover.
I think that the few things to notice from this is that it is frequently the case that the government supported the management and the owners against the labor union. And then 2, if there's extra labor available, they can break the strike, bring in new workers to run the industry. So the labor unions are hurt by that. So the labor doesn't always win and get their way. Okay. And 2, I will tell you that there's actually a very similar example to this. I'm actually working on a doctorate in history, and I ran across, there was one in 1934 in Honeypath, South Carolina, in a textile mill, and it was a general strike across the South in the textile mills, and 7 people were killed in somewhat of a similar situation, where the mill owner, or rather operator, not the owner, was also the mayor of the town, and he basically deputized some people who shot some people who were on strike, and within the same small town. All right, small town, South Carolina. So there's a lot of kind of ugly incidents in American labor history, just on either side of violence. But I think the fact that I think it's important to recognize usually the government supported the management, the owners wanting stability, right? So that business could happen. It's what usually was valued. Right, go through history for another kind of couple points here. So John Rockefeller is the famous guy from Standard Oil. So what he did here was he had started this business, okay, and I'm actually got another video on this one. And so this is the time where oil was really starting to pick up before automobiles, okay? So we're talking about in the later 1800s, 1880s, 1890s. And so at this point, we're talking about oil for heating and for lamps and things like that, before widespread electricity. So it's kind of like at that sort of like dividing point in the history of technology. And so what he does is he gets himself some control of, he's the oil refiner. So he takes the oil and makes products that are useful from it. So vertical integration means he would buy up the transportation infrastructure to get stuff to where he was, and then what once he makes it, to distribute it somewhere else, or at least have control over it in good rates. And then horizontal integration means people who were his competitors on the side, he would buy them up. Okay. And so basically what he would do is he would lower, sorry, I gotta go. He would lower his prices so that other people would lose money, so then he could buy them out. And then theoretically he could raise prices. He didn't do it that much, but once you have monopolies, which is one person or company controlling way too much of something, theoretically even all of it, they can control production and prices in a way that is not a fair competition. So in the long run, that hurts consumers because they have less options and higher prices, right? So this is a history of Rockefeller and his money. What I want to point out here, I know I have on the assessment this Friday, is that the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was a government, a law passed by the U.S. government to allow them to break up monopolies, which they called trusts a lot of times because of the way they had them organized, and to stop new monopolies from forming. And the Standard Oil is the most famous of those. So I'll kind of watch this and learn a few things from this one.
When you look at the wealthiest men alive today, topping the charts are tech billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. But actually, the wealthiest businessman to have ever lived died almost a century ago. In today's video, we'll be looking at a business empire so vast that even after 100 years of technological progress, no man has managed to overtake its founder. This is the history of Standard Oil. This video is brought to you by Dollar Shave Club. Rockefeller and are actually pretty humble. It all starts in 1839 with the birth of John Rockefeller in upstate New York. He was the eldest son of a traveling merchant who identified himself as a botanic physician, but in reality was selling the 19th century equivalent of homeopathic medicine. He would spend weeks away from home and in fact would have several children with another woman, who he decided to bring back home to his wife so they could all live together. In this very confusing household, John would grow up learning how to hustle people for the best deal possible and how to get the most out of every penny he got.
They were a little bit nicer than they should be toward his dad. His dad was a scam artist, basically.
His family would rarely stay in one place for long, and John would live this nomadic lifestyle ever since he was 3 years old. To help his mother, John would earn any money he could by raising turkeys or doing work for neighbors. His intelligence was put to good use when the family moved to Cleveland, Ohio in 1854, where he got the chance to attend a proper school. But less than a year later, John dropped out in order to work as a bookkeeper at the local produce broker. He would earn 50 cents per day, which obviously wasn't much at the time, so he would help other companies on the side. But after 2 years of working there, his bosses refused to give him a meaningful raise, so he decided to one-up them by starting his own produce brokerage. Thanks to his good reputation, he got a loan of $4,000, which at the time was a huge sum. John started trading.
Well, they say he basically was like a warehouse where they would buy and like sell stuff, like, agricultural products, is what it say.
Hay, grain, and various meats, and in his first year, he recorded sales of $500,000, of which he only got a small fraction as commissions, but still it was a huge success. Every bank in Cleveland was begging John to borrow money, and he was barely 18 years old. But then in 1859, something happened that would change his life forever. Just 100 miles east of Cleveland, the first American oil well had been discovered. This marked the beginning of the Pennsylvania oil rush, and within a year, 4,500 barrels of oil would be produced. Now, back then oil wasn't quite as valuable as it is today. Gasoline cars hadn't been invented yet, but oil could still be processed into kerosene, which people would then use in lamps. John realized, however, that the biggest profits to be had weren't in drilling for oil, but in refining it. He witnessed many people going bust before striking oil, so he knew that the business was too risky for him. Instead, he'd let others go through the hassle of finding the oil, and he would just buy it off of them. John had to wait until 1863 for the government to build a rail line connecting the Pennsylvania oil fields to Cleveland. But when that line was built, John was ready for it, with a long line of partners and banks ready to back him up. He also assembled a team of seasoned chemists and engineers, who not only optimized the refining process, but also discovered various uses for the byproducts of refining petroleum. You see, the early refineries in Cleveland could only operate at about a 60% efficiency, but John not only increased that percentage, he also started selling all the byproducts, like paraffin wax, tar, and naphtha. Within 2 years, the Rockefeller refinery was worth over $70,000.
So when he's talking about like with byproducts, is you know the lip stuff, like Carmex and things like that. Those sort of things are also oil byproducts. So what it's saying is Rockefeller learns how to use different parts of the oil to be able to sell it and do different things with it.
And was among the largest in Cleveland. But John wasn't done. In 1865, there were 26 competing refineries, but within 5 years, John had acquired all but 4 of them.
So that's
by this point,
horizontal
his
integration.
business was getting too big to handle as a partnership, so in 1870 he incorporated as Standard Oil of Ohio. To convince the few remaining competitors in Cleveland, John would simply invite them over and show them his books, revealing that he could operate at a loss far longer than they could stay solvent. In exchange for a good buyout price, John would offer his competitors positions in his own company, thus placing the brightest minds in the industry under his control. Of course, not everyone would give up immediately, and over time, John eroded the price of oil and kerosene, sometimes by as much as 80%, in order to strangle competitors. Unsurprisingly, his strategy worked. By 1880, he had acquired refineries across the northeastern US and was refining over 90% of the entire country's oil production. At this point, John was so powerful that he could invite the owners of the big rail companies and personally negotiate rebates for using their trains. But this practice of negotiating backroom deals...
So the rebates thing means that they would charge him less to haul his stuff because they were hauling so much of it, all right, which gave him a further advantage.
Really got the business world riled up. At the time, and still kind of today, most industrial goods were transported by rail. And many big industrialists got worried that John's abuse of transportation rebates could result in similar monopolization in their industries. Over the next decade, businessmen, politicians, and the media would attack Standard Oil with increasing ferocity. Legislators in Ohio began drafting antitrust regulations to bring down Rockefeller, but he was one step ahead. In 1882, he reincorporated in New Jersey, this time creating the Standard Oil Trust, which in turn held stakes in over 40 local companies. Then, to showcase his success, John built an impressive headquarters for his company on Broadway. This moment was the high point of Rockefeller's Standard Oil.
Think about like the Rockefeller Center and stuff like that in New York, right? So that's kind of the connection back to there. But he's actually from Cleveland.
He owned 20,000 oil wells, 4,000 miles of pipeline, and employed over 100,000 people. But his grip on the oil industry was loosening, both domestically and abroad. Massive oil deposits had been discovered in Russia and in Asia, and were being developed by the Rothschild family, which spared no effort in getting that oil to America. Worse yet, in 1890, the federal government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which officially gave politicians the teeth to go after the Standard Oil Trust itself. Of course,
that's General Sherman's brother. He was a senator from Ohio, so if you know the Civil War, that's his brother.
The complex legal structure behind all the companies was very difficult to investigate, which is why the government couldn't actually break up Standard Oil until 1911. By that point, however, John Rockefeller had already cashed in and was no longer actively managing the company. In the final 20 years of his company's existence, it had paid out over $500 million in dividends. By some estimates, the true worth of Standard Oil at its peak was $1 trillion, so the breakup didn't really come as a surprise to most people. In 1911, the Supreme Court found Standard Oil guilty of anti-competitive practices and broke the company up into 34 separate entities. Of course, John Rockefeller kept his stake in those companies until his death, and in fact it turns out that the breakup was the most profitable event in his life. You see, over time, many of those companies merged back with one another. Today, most of the Standard remnants are part of either ExxonMobil, Chevron, or BP, which have since become incredibly large companies in their own right.
So a lot of the oil companies around are descendants of the breakup of Standard Oil. So if you're like, I never heard of Standard Oil, that's right. It's because they broke it up, and then these other parts were like Standard Oil of Ohio or Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, and then they eventually changed the names, kind of thing.
John Rockefeller's ownership of these successor companies made him the richest businessman to have ever lived, with an estimated net worth of $400 billion. Even today, no one has beaten Rockefeller in the leaderboard. Not even Jeff Bezos himself seems likely to achieve that. But there's one thing that Jeff Bezos does have that John Rockefeller never did, despite all his money, and that is access to Dollar Shave Club.
And so they use that for the advertisement. Anyway, so the deal is they kind of show
when you look at the wealthiest,
how they were able to build up the biggest, these big organizations, and then how the U.S. started going after them and trying to break up those monopolies, right? And so that's why Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, those guys were all more wealthy than people are probably going to ever get again. But also just understand that with that wealth, interestingly enough, they ended up giving a lot of it away. And so, we live in the South, and the education was so bad here. Rockefeller, ended up giving millions and millions of dollars to, build schools and things in the South, and training for teachers and agriculture to help with agriculture and things of that nature too. And so, there's good and there's bad with it, right? So Carnegie, built lots of libraries and schools and things of that nature. So there's good and there's bad, right? All right. So other things about modern labor. So historically, the largest labor union organization was called the AFL, American Federation of Labor, and CIO, which is the something of the industrial organizations, right? And so within that, it was those are like umbrella organizations with lots of labor unions for people who are like electricians or plumbers or whatever within that have millions of members even today, even though there's been a decline in organized labor over time, right? All right. Now, another point to consider historically with regards to labor is organized workers were very easy for people like the owners and the managers and whatever, when they would organize and they would strike and look out for the workers or whatever. People, the managers and the business owners would complain that they were being controlled by communists, which was usually not true at all. But we were very scared of communist influence. So especially during the Cold War era from 1945 to 1991, the labor movement had to be very careful to not appear to be pro-communist, and had to really distance themselves from anything that sounded like communism or even socialism. So that's something I know I put on the quiz, because I want you to really make sure you understand the fear of communism and how that really moderated what labor was able to argue for in the United States for a very, very long time. All right. So just make sure this is clear, right? This may be obvious to you, maybe not. So I'm gonna say it anyway. The owners and the management didn't want workers to unionize, because if the workers unionize, then the unions would argue against what management wanted. Management wanted to maximize profits and be able to keep wages low and have long working hours, not have to do things to make for safe working conditions, etc. And so the union was against the financial interests of the owners, right? Okay, so here's this term collective bargaining, right? So collective means together, right? Bargaining means arguing for your viewpoint. So the union representatives would meet with the company representatives that would be the people who are arguing for what the owners and management want, to discuss their working conditions, their pay, their other stuff, right? And this process definitely helped the workers over time, for sure. Okay. And so it did benefit working conditions for the workers. Um, Now, union efforts also are involved in, you know, arguing with, to get the government to pass laws and make regulations for safer working conditions, lowering the number, I should say, working hours, not working horse. All right. Just general better working conditions and better treatment of the worker. Right. Now, there were some of these that happened in the early 1900s, which was called the Progressive Era. No relation to the progressive movement in the Democratic Party today. Um, and then during the New Deal, right, with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, during the Great Depression and trying to do things for the workers then, right, a lot of which didn't necessarily work that well at the time, but have really, uh, uh, but have really defined our modern economy. Okay, in terms of the rules that are in place to protect the workers today. Okay. All right. Now, what I wanted to point out to you here is that there are states where unions kind of have more power, and then there's states that are called right to work states. Okay. So the orange states on this map are the union states. The blue ones are the right to work states. And those are laws that make it where you cannot be forced to join a union when you're hired. So we are in South Carolina a right to work state. That does not mean that you can't have unions. It just means that they can't have the same sort of power to force people to join them, which effectively means that the labor unions are not very powerful if they're there at all. Right? Okay. Problems for unions and getting better wages and benefits. So limitations on unions. One is increasing global competition. So free trade, especially, hurts unions because it allows for trade with places that have lower wages. So if people in other countries are paid less, then goods are cheaper, which hurt businesses. That would make it really hard for you to argue for higher wages here when a company could say, all right, well, fine, we'll go get the work done in Vietnam or something, right? Another thing that hurts unions in getting better wages is immigration of large number of unskilled laborers. Right? Unskilled does not mean they're not capable of learning skills. Okay, that's not what that means. It just means that maybe they're not trained in those things. Okay, so having more labor means unions could not, and again, I've got a misprint here, demand as much in terms of wages, etc. All right. So basically, if you got other workers who are willing to do the same amount of work for cheaper, then as a union, you can't really argue for higher wages very effectively. Okay. Because they could just hire more workers, other workers. Like, oh, you don't want to work? Fine. We'll get somebody else to do it. Right. Um, Now, some other things that are generally not good for the power of labor unions um, is a decreased demand for their products because then, well, you don't need that many workers anyway. Decreasing union membership. So if they don't have as much funds in their union or they can't claim to represent all the workers, that's not going to be very good for the labor union's bargaining power either. And then if they don't have the amount of workers, the skilled workers, then that means they can't really, bargain for better conditions either. Right. So, today still, management and owners are going to prefer less government regulation and less union power. Obviously, they're not at the level they were in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so basically, the management or owner wants as much economic freedom as possible to make their profits higher. Okay. All right. A couple of other things we got here. I think we got 3 more slides. All right. Minimum wage. Okay. So minimum wage can be confusing for people sometimes. So minimum wage is the legally lowest amount that can be paid to workers. So, before the Industrial Revolution, there was no such thing, okay, as legal minimum wage. So workers were during the Industrial Revolution are the ones that wanted a minimum wage established. Why? that meant they had to be paid at least a certain amount. They couldn't be paid like almost nothing. Okay. The owners and management did not want a minimum wage. All right. Think late 1800s, early 1900s. They wanted to pay as little as possible for their workers. Okay. So today our minimum wage is $7.25 an hour in the nation as a whole. States can go higher, but not lower. Right. So many will go higher based on higher living costs. So, for example, in California, it costs a lot more to live there, right? Housing and so forth, groceries, higher prices. So therefore, the minimum wage is higher. That doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't actually, that the higher minimum wage means they have a higher standard of living there compared to here. No. So if you make $11 an hour or 12, I don't remember what the minimum wage in California is, that's not really worth more than $7.25 in South Carolina because the cost of living is so much higher, right? But again, that's the least that can be charged, can be paid in the entire nation, but it can be higher in some states. Why did we not raise the minimum wage a lot? Well, if you set the minimum wage higher, the prices that the businesses had to set to be able to pay their workers would be higher. So you probably would just have a lot of inflation, meaning prices would just go up, right? More money out in the economy. And two, if businesses have to pay their workers more, they'll actually hire less people. So there'll be less money, right? Or there'll be less people getting jobs, higher unemployment. So it may not actually help the economy anyway. So that's the reason there's like a equilibrium of what minimum wage can be realistically as well. All right, now I just one more point I want to make about labor and why doesn't everybody just go on strike for better wages? Well, I think a good comparison here, and I think I made one of the essay questions on that this week, is this. All right, so NBA, professional basketball players or professional baseball players in the MLB, when they go on strike, they get what they want, right? But a couple years ago, McDonald's workers went on strike for $15 an hour, and they didn't get it. Why? Here's the difference. When the labor of the worker cannot be replaced, they get what they want when they strike. So in other words, if McDonald's workers strike for $15 an hour, they can find people who will work for cheaper than that. Okay. Now, in the NBA, you can't find people to replace professional basketball players if they all sit out, who people will pay as much money to watch play basketball, right? Therefore, there's like a supply and demand thing here. There is a replacement labor force available in fast food, okay? They can do just as well. But in professional sports, there's not a replacement labor force that is as good. Therefore, they have more bargaining power, so to speak, in collective bargaining to negotiate and get what they want. All right, very important example to really understand why sometimes strikes work and why they don't, and why everybody just doesn't go on strike all the time. All right, so in conclusion, unions, which is workers working together for better conditions, do have an important role in the economy, but there are definitely factors that restrict how much they can accomplish. Okay, so this week there are 2 ad minims, tutorial and mastery quiz, another live lesson, and then economics quiz 7 on Friday, which is actually 80-20 multiple choice on progress learning to 20% essay on Canvas. Then next week, there's not live lessons, but there'll be an ad minimum tutorial each day from different aspects of personal finance. Okay, and the expectations at this point, I will grade all of that work. All right, and that is it for today.